and not allow countries to increase spending, despite the fact that we need to have higher spending. And at the same time, green industrial policy has come to the forefront, and we'll hear more from our speakers, in part because of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And so we wrote a report called Beyond the Bottom Line, where we look at green industrial policy and we look at fiscal policy and say that Europe is constricted, and there's a conflict between fiscal policy and green industrial policy. And how should we design green industrial policy so that we can maximize climate action, but also maximize social welfare gains through green industrial policy? And so this is why we have brought together this really great panel today to discuss the topic of green industrial policy and see whether Europe is set up right to be able to implement green industrial policy to maximize social welfare gains and to maximize climate action. So maybe without further ado, I can introduce our great panelists. We'll be starting today with Todd Tucker, who's the Director of Industrial Policy at the Roosevelt Institute. We'll then hear from Judith Curtin Darling, who is the Deputy Secretary General at IndustriALL. And then Daniela Gabor will speak, who's a Professor of Economics and Macro Finance at the University West of England. And finally, we'll have Michael Bloss, who's a member of the European Parliament and from the Green Group. He will talk a bit about what's happening currently around the Net Zero Industry Act and his view of how green industrial policies should be moving ahead in Europe. Todd, maybe I'll hand over to you. Maybe you can just introduce yourself in a couple of words and talk us through a bit about how the US industrial policy is shaping up and how implementation is going so far, and how you expect industrial policy to continue to develop in the US.
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Well, I'm Todd Tucker. I'm a political scientist at the Roosevelt Institute, which is the think tank partner of the FDR in New York. We're a team of about 50 researchers, affiliated academics from the fields of history, social science, and legal theory, political theory, that are working across a wide range of political economy questions. I lead our team that does work on industrial policy and trade. And so, as you can imagine, we've been following quite closely a lot of the economic changes, not just during Biden, but also under Trump, as it related to sort of trade and industry questions. And I think that it's useful in trying to understand the last few years of U.S. policy development to sort of take a little bit of a broader view as to sort of what my generation of policy thinkers and policymakers have kind of been dealing with over the last 20 or 30 years, which is that most economists will tell you that the ideal economic policy for dealing with climate change would be something like a carbon tax or carbon price. The U.S. has now had a few goes at trying to make that happen. And the problem is, under our system, where divided government is a quite frequent occurrence, we sort of learned the hard way under the Obama administration with something called the Waxman-Markey Act, which was basically would have instituted a carbon price, would have instituted sort of something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and would have had a variety of sort of regulatory standards that would have made it more costly for fossil fuel infrastructure and industry to operate. That failed spectacularly. And then within a few months later, Democrats lost unified party control, for over a decade after that. And so given the scale and urgency of the climate crisis, as we headed towards 2020, it became clear that, it's simply instituting a price and then hoping that all the relevant firms and workforces and state and local governments and everybody else that would need to have sort of a strong coordination towards decarbonizing the economy, that wasn't going to work. Even if we could have passed a carbon price, that wouldn't have changed the facts on the ground quickly enough and in a coordinated enough way to both sort of decarbonize and keep a democracy going. So what ended up happening was, after Trump was elected, it became clear on the sort of Democratic Party side that the response to that would appear both in terms of the messaging just as strong as in support of deindustrialized regions and workers left behind, but actually do something effective to advance their interest, was going to look something like industrial policy. And the U.S. has always had an industrial policy, but it's been largely confined to the defense sector. It had been, this is sort of the first real go since the 1930s and 40s of doing a comprehensive industrial strategy and restructuring for the civilian economy, and for clean energy and semiconductors in particular. So there were three big pieces of legislation that were passed in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. That's the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And there's a lot in there. These were enormous bills that I think ultimately some banks estimate is going to amount to trillions of dollars of spending, which is actually considerably more than the price tag that was attached to them by the Congressional Budget Office, which scores our legislation. And that's because a lot of the spending is going to take the form of uncapped tax credits, which means that projects that qualify for them get them fairly automatically, actually. And I'll sort of just say a little bit more about the policy design of kind of the two main tools that are in this toolbox. One, as I already sort of suggested, is uncapped tax credits, where essentially 30% of the project capital cost will be covered so long as a project developer is is producing clean hydrogen or is producing solar panels or wind power, or what have you. 30% will be covered. And then companies can qualify for additional amounts of funding if they are sort of essentially good corporate actors that are doing sort of strong labor conditions, investing in poor communities, using domestic supply chains. None of that additional stuff is a requirement unless the companies want to get more tax credit. And so if you do everything that a project could do, both sort of producing domestically and producing clean energy and all the different social conditions attached, you could have up to 70% of the project cost covered. So a significant subsidy. However, it's not the kind of tax credit. There's a political scientist in the U.S. called Suzanne Mettler that has a great book that I highly recommend to everyone called The Submerged State. And the thesis is basically that because of U.S. institutions and the weakness of our institutions, we often do things very quietly through the tax code, so that we're not accused of being profligate spenders or really anyone noticing what's going on. I think that what's qualitatively different about this is that we're using the tax credits to achieve a variety of highly visible social conditions. So in a sense, we're using the submerged state to unsubmerge the state in a way. And I think one feature I would point to that's also I think relevant for this conversation, which is that the Treasury Department announced yesterday some of the definitions and criteria for non-capitalist projects getting project financing. So historically, the problem with tax credits is that you can't claim a tax credit if you don't owe any tax. But and sort of nonprofit organizations, state and local governments, tribal governments, cooperatives, nonprofit cooperatives, nonprofit organizations, none of these would typically owe any federal tax. And so the way that we've resolved that so that they can also get project financing is that we will treat it as if they had paid tax, and then the Treasury Department will just cut them a check for the amount that would normally be going just to private developers. So that's kind of an interesting innovation. The other main tool that's being used is a series of discretionary grants and loans that are going to clean energy and going to the semiconductor industry. And the law, as it was written, doesn't have a lot of conditions attached to it, fairly minimal conditions, but the regulators have shown a lot of creativity and have used their discretion to design a fairly robust set of conditions that can be attached to projects. And the way it works is the following: say that two different investors come to the government with a project that, in terms of the basic economics and finance, look fairly identical. So similar rates of return, similar expected production. If those are similar, if one project comes and shows that they have worked in close collaboration with labor unions, worked in close collaboration with community and environmental justice groups, that they have a plan to provide childcare and support to the local government to develop transportation and public transportation to the work site, the more kind of socially minded, labor-minded things that the project does, if it's competing with a proposal that doesn't do all of those things, then the one that does the more ambitious high road practices are going to get the grant and the other one isn't. And so, this is, even though some of the basic outlines of the tools look similar to the kinds of things that the US has practiced in the past, there's some important innovations in the specific way that they're working on the ground. And we're already seeing some very exciting results in terms of, I think that the political theory of the case, of doing all of these pieces of spending legislation was that the Supreme Court was less likely to overturn spending legislation than they would a tax or a regulation, which they often overturn. So that would have meant that we would have wasted 2 years and not had anything to show for it in terms of our international climate credibility. So that, that was sort of like one part of it, that we needed to have it survive Supreme Court review, or at least have a good chance of doing so. And the other thing is that we needed to flood essentially a lot of money into Republican states and Republican districts, so that even if the Republican Party doesn't believe in climate science, they will believe in climate jobs. And that was the theory. And we've already had two evidence that theory is working. One is that the midterm elections was the best for the incumbent party that we've had since the 1930s. So even though the Democrats lost a slight control of the House, it was by a small margin, and actually gained seats in the Senate, which is really historically unusual in the US context. So that was proof point number one. Proof point number two was that the Republicans, when they did take over the House of Representatives, said that the number one negotiating objective for raising the debt ceiling was going to be getting rid of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies. And then when it turned out that they actually started polling their members, they didn't have the votes for that, because the battery facilities and the solar panel facilities are going into districts where even the craziest, nuttiest, climate science hating Republicans actually don't want to see the jobs leave their district. So I think that those are two pieces of evidence that suggest that the political theory behind the IRA actually made sense as an international climate credibility building exercise. And I'll just sort of end by noting that because, so even though some of this money, even though, a lot of the money, the vast majority, will be flowing to private developers, because it's public money, the publicness of the money is important, because it creates organizing opportunities for civil society on the ground. And what we're finding is that labor unions and civil society groups are tracking where the money is going, and they're using it as an opportunity to mobilize the workforce and the community to have union neutrality in the first instance. And then they're actually winning union campaigns already in some of the facilities that are getting public money. Even in the most anti-union jurisdictions in the country, they are winning elections by large margins. And so I think that shows that, obviously in the US, we want to correct the anti-union bias of our federal law. We want to have childcare. We want to have sort of all the things that were sort of the initial proposal of Build Back Better, a lot of which didn't get it into the final package. But what we're finding is the second best is that all of this money going out the door creates thousands of organizing opportunities across the country to get some of the things that were left out. So I think that, the mood in the US, especially among sort of progressive climate people, is very high right now. And I think that we're optimistic also about, how this will influence the outcome of the 2024 elections as well.
Thank you, Todd, for this overview of what's happening in the US. Now moving from the US to Europe, Judith, do you want to give us a quick refresher of what the EU's Green Deal Industrial Plan is shaping up to be, and what your assessment is? And do you think that what the Commission has presented is a win for climate and a win for workers?
Man, I would love to have been able to give that presentation that Todd's just given. I mean, that was so uplifting. And I think in Europe, what's very striking is that if we think about the debate last year, in the summer of last year, when the IRA or the ERA, so we don't have to talk about the IRA in a positive light, was kind of being finalized, and we were watching blow by blow the votes on Capitol Hill. Would it be passed? Would it not be passed? With what majority? At that point, we were already seeing industry in Europe saying this is American protectionism. We need to rally against this. We need to say that that this isn't the right way. And I think what's very striking is the shift from that discussion last summer to where we are today, in that particularly as the trade union movement, we watched the discussion about Build Back Better right from the beginning, seeing how the social conditionalities were being mainstreamed and threaded through the whole US agenda. And therefore, in the autumn of last year, we were very loudly saying, as organised labour in Europe, we want, to be fair, we have been saying for decades now that Europe needs an industrial policy, an industrial strategy, that the logic of the past, which was very dominant, that Europe was a service economy and that meant that you didn't need to do much about manufacturing, is a completely false story, especially when you look at the scale of the Green Deal in Europe. The position of industrial, we represent manufacturing, mining and energy workers right across the European continent. And we were very clear that the Green Deal could not be delivered if it didn't come hand in hand with a clean industrial strategy, which had social conditionality and just transition really embedded directly in it. At the moment in Europe, what we've had is a Green Deal framework where just transition has been a kind of awkward add-on. We've had to try and force a discussion about the social impact of climate action into debates and spaces where there's little understanding or appreciation of the scale of the changes that are underway in our industries, but also in society more broadly. And so the model which is kind of developed in the US, in our view, is extremely inspiring. And therefore, in the autumn, we were saying, look, let's not tear down the US agenda and throw rocks at them as protectionists, but let's say, okay, we put the Green Deal on the table. The US has put the kind of package of the CHIPS Act, IRA, and the infrastructure legislation on the table. Now let's up the ante further. Let's create a high road agenda around policy, which is about embedding social acceptance of the changes which we need to see in order to reach our climate ambitions by 2050, but bringing the people who are the proverbial and the actual coalface with us, giving them a stake in the game, giving them skin in the game so that they feel that this is their agenda. And I think Todd's comments about, the midterm election results and the defense of projects by some of the actors in the US is really evidence of why that's the right strategy to go. What have we got in Europe, which is what you asked me really to talk about, Sebastian, is that we've kind of got old wine in old bottles. We've got repackaged measures. It's not all bad, and I don't want to say, I don't want to have a very negative intervention. What is fantastic is industrial policy is high up the political agenda in Europe, and it's back as a legitimate debate to be having. It's great that the Green Deal industrial plan sets out an agenda which is about strategic technologies which will be necessary for the decarbonisation of our economy. It's a shame that we didn't, within that plan, take a value chain approach like they did in the US, where you see really the sexy technologies linked to the bedrock of the industrial fabric that's necessary to deliver them. So that's a kind of slight shame for us. But the big missing bit, there are two maybe. On the one hand, there's the whole financing framework. We're over-reliant in Europe on state aid. We just had the latest report on how state aid has been used. It's not that there's no industrial policy in Europe, it's just some countries and some regions are very active and other places are not active, and that creates a patchwork of experience and undermines our collective strength as a continent behind climate goals. So the reliance on state aid means that 50% of the state aid has been allowed in Germany, 9% of German GDP, whereas we have other member states where there is very little industrial investment. And even in the Recovery and Resilience Fund national plans, where you would have thought with 30% targeted at climate action that there would be a big wave of money going into the decarbonisation of industry. We've seen some countries where there's barely any effort to tie that Resilience Recovery Fund to the decarbonisation of industry and the twin transition, because after the pandemic, we can see the digital and the green are intensifying each other. And are no longer two distinct transitions, but are increasingly, in our view, quite interlinked. So that has been disappointing, I think. And the discussion about European level resources has really been extremely limited and way below what is actually necessary. I mean, the Innovation Fund was something that we fought for as a trade union movement against, I should say, some of the policymakers in the European Commission who said there would be no appetite for that kind of fund. The first call for projects showed that there was, I can't even remember, it was something like 10 times the amount of industrial appetite compared to the amount of money which was put on the table from the ETS. So there is a real need for instruments at European level around broad industrial decarbonisation, alongside a framework to ensure that we're really decarbonising not just big multinational companies who can already deal with the administration, but we're decarbonising our fabric, which includes support for all of the SMEs and smaller companies as well. We're still missing this imagination in the European framework and in the Green Deal industrial plan. And I think the report that you produced from the New Economics Foundation shows the real potential limits of not tying up a macroeconomic agenda and fiscal rules agenda with ambitious climate industrial policies. The impact socially will be terrible, and that brings me maybe to the next point, which is really critical for us, is that when we heard Commission President von der Leyen in Davos set out the Green Deal industrial plan in February, there were these four elements. I'm going to summarize, and probably not very politely: deregulate, finance, skills, and trade. And the biggest Achilles heel that we hear from our industrial counterparts in Europe at the moment is labour shortages. And yet the whole social dimension of the industrial plan is incredibly weak when you compare to what the US have put on the table. If you look at the EV credits in the IRA and the fact that 15% of the work has to be undertaken by accredited apprenticeships, that's an enormous shot in the arm in terms of bringing young people into industries which have terrible demographic triangles. We have an awful demographic situation in European manufacturing across the board. We can't find the people to do the jobs that we need today to deliver our climate targets today in a whole range of skills levels and industries, from medium, low-skilled jobs right up to the high-skilled jobs. So the idea that we're not massively charging a social agenda inside an industrial policy agenda is a completely lost opportunity. And with European policy, we would actually be in a better position than the US if we were brave enough to do it, because we have legislation at European level where we could say that there were social conditions applied to state aid rules. I know my German union counterparts, our members in Germany, are fighting very hard on social conditionality in German state aid and public support for industry, but we should have that at European level. If there is public money going to industry, there should be social conditionalities attached, linked to collective bargaining, linked to quality job criteria, linked to bringing new people into industry, investment in training. We have an enormous skills challenge in Europe. We are going to have to reskill and upskill millions of workers in the next decade. And yet we see very clear regulatory frameworks for emissions reduction, very clear regulatory frameworks for how business can access money. But voluntary measures, cooperations of the willing when it comes to skills and reskilling and upskilling. This is just an enormous lost opportunity to really have an imaginative agenda at European level, to use all the levers of industrial policy. I can see I've spoken too long, so I will stop, but to use all the levers of industrial policy that we have, social and environmental criteria on public contracts, social and environmental criteria on public money, and ensuring that we're being consistent about not just going for the sexy parts of industry, but actually going for an industrial policy which is about the transformation of our whole industrial fabric. Thanks.
Thank you, Judith. That was really interesting. And just a quick side note, if you've got questions from the audience, you can put them into the Q&A and we'll try to get to them, and perhaps if we have enough time, we'll also give the floor to you, but please do add your questions. But moving on, Daniela, you've written a piece on on the de-risking state. Maybe you could define that and compare and contrast the US and the EU approach.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I feel that coming after Judith that I will reinforce the sort of somber tone of evaluating the European turn to industrial policy. And in that piece that you mentioned, Sebastian, I work through the macro-financial aspect of industrial policy that has a kind of parallel or equivalent in the financing pillar of the Net Zero Industrial Act. And what I ask there is, how do we think about the way in which the state organizes its relationship with the businesses or with the private capital that is going to benefit from its industrial policy, from its strategic ambitions? And I use the term de-risking to think about that, not because I came up with it. This is the terminology that the European Commission uses, for example, in the Net Zero Industrial Act, the terminology that the Commissioner Breton uses. And de-risking, or the de-risking state, and this is very important because it links to Judith's intervention around the importance of thinking about the fiscal issues. So the premise of the de-risking state or of de-risking based industrial policy is that there is not enough fiscal space for the state to address policy challenges through traditional public investment or through state-owned companies. So what it does, it has to mobilize private finance, it has to mobilize private capital to escort private capital, or you could call it bribing, and you will see in a second why I think bribing is not necessarily the wrong word here. It has to bribe private capital into these policy priorities. And the risking basically does what it says on the tin, but it moves some of the risks from the private sector onto the balance sheet of the state. It makes projects more investable, like clean tech investment or clean tech manufacturing more investable, but you can apply that to a series of issues, including biodiversity, incidentally. And the state can increase investability by either regulatory de-risking, which is it reduces the regulations that are changing or affecting risk return profiles. It can do financial de-risking through loans, and it can do fiscal de-risking. And the bulk of both the US IRA and the Net Zero Industrial Act is through fiscal de-risking, which is it extends tax credits or subsidies in order to encourage or escort private capital to encourage investment in particular areas. So when we hear that the state is back, the state it is indeed back. It moves away from the kind of age that we know in the European Union of industrial policy. But what it does, it tinkers with price signals to make projects more attractive to private capital. And I see two problems with that, or two questions. Is first, we have to ask how successful can industrial policy be on those terms, particularly when we think that the Europe will be competing with the US and China. And then is this de-risking based approach the right gateway to decarbonization, where you don't only need to encourage certain sectors, but you need to shrink others? And my answer to the first question of how successful can this be, I think we will see next week that there is not much reason to be optimistic, because the way in which the European Commission is trying to circumvent the fiscal obstacles that we have and the problems with state aid that Judy just described is to say, if we want to become internationally or to gain market share internationally in clean tech, we have to somehow have an estimate of 100 billion in clean tech, and there is a series of clean tech sectors. And then it works back from there through de-risking multipliers that it calculates from other projects like, or other vehicles like InvestEU, to come up with a figure of 18 billion public money that needs to go at a European level, and setting aside all the complicated questions of where the money, where does the money go, and whether only Germany benefits from it. And the problem with this assumption is that somehow if you put 20 billion of public money, there will be 80 billion of private capital that would work given general market conditions and price signals. And what is the problem, and Todd alluded to it, is that there is a lot of carrot and very little stick in this approach, as in there are very few conditionalities that we know from traditional experiences of successful experiences of industrial policy that are embedded in this approach that would sort of give us some confidence that the European ambitions would work. And Todd alluded again, the US CHIPS Act, for example, has some of those conditionalities that would ensure that private capital goes or remains aligned with the strategic priorities of industrial policy, even when market conditions change or when risk return profiles change. Think about Shell, for example. Until earlier this year, we all thought it had a great transition plan. It's now dropped most of its renewable investments to go back to fossil fuels. So that's one problem. De-risking by itself creates this logic of increasing carrots, reducing sticks. And the second problem, and I think here the European, I think Todd made a very convincing case that the specific domestic politics of the US made or rendered de-risking the only politically feasible strategy for the US IRA. But in Europe, we had a very different story until last year, because the European Commission, together with the European Central Bank, were prepared to take a different approach to decarbonization that would have been also very useful for industrial policy, for green industrial policy, because we had a sustainable finance taxonomy that could have been used in order to redirect credit flows and financing from dirty to green sectors. We had the ECB designing a framework for decarbonizing its monetary policy framework, or decarbonizing its monetary policy interventions. And since the US IRA and since the pressures that European businesses have been putting, what we are seeing is basically not much social conditionality at European level, but the European political ambitions to continue with a decarbonization approach that uses the power of the state to shrink dirty activities, that is gone out of the window. The ECB has basically dropped all its attempts to penalize dirty capital. The sustainable finance taxonomy, in my view, has now so many holes in it that very few people are willing to defend it as a proper green taxonomy. So these are my two concerns that I worry it's not going to deliver in the way the de-risking-based industrial policy is not going to deliver on European ambitions, and that also has longer-term political consequences, because we will say, well, we tried industrial policy and it didn't work. And second, it is the wrong way to do decarbonization, as in it's not enough. We can't only work with sticks through markets, through private capital, and hope that somehow market signals will shift so dirty sectors shrink. The example of Shell, or even the example of EV manufacturing and EV cars in the US following subsidies from US IRA, I think, are kind of powerful to say that it is very plausible that with de-risking based industrial policy, we get a disorderly expansion of green capital that ends up in greenwashing without delivering on decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Danila. So having heard interventions from the first three speakers, what do you make of these points, and how big of a win do you think the Net Zero Industry Act is, Micha?
Yeah, thanks. It's very interesting. I just want a few points, and I think some of the ideas from the US, maybe we can even think about implementing them more in the EU. Well, first of all, I think the sexy part of this policies are the jobs. Judith said it's the industrial side, but I think it's actually the other way around, because that's at least how I read what is happening in the US. The way you are selling this Inflation Reduction Act is via job creation. And we are missing that part. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we are not really. So I believe we have been with the Green Deal, with the Fit for 55 pledge, with the ETS, so the carbon market, with the end of the combustion engine. I mean, there are some kind of policies, regulatory market policies that will bring CO2 emissions down. That's good. We have, well, I hope soon, new renewable energy targets that will bring us to around 80% renewable energy in 2030. That's also great. But now the question is really, can we win this again in terms of manufacturing capacity, in terms of jobs? I mean, who is producing the means of this transformation? And currently, it's not us. Currently, the solar panels, they come from China. Wind manufacturing is going down. If you look into heat pumps, it's basically currently this uptake of heat pump installation in the EU is mainly fed from an increase of heat production in Asia. So we would be very smart if we would also win this in terms of creating this manufacturing sites in the EU, but it's not happening, and that's a huge problem. It's actually quite stupid, I would say. We heard this week that the only company that started to produce again solar PV cells in Germany, in Europe, thinks about moving to the US because conditions are better there. So the question is really why I mean, it's not a big win to answer the question, and why are we not winning this? It doesn't make sense in the first place. So what is if you look into the net zero industry, I mean, basically it has this goals, this okay, we want to have, for instance, 30 gigawatt PV production in 2030, and different kinds of goals in terms of how to increase the production. Then it says that permitting, permitting of building this in industrial sites and in public procurement, you can use social and environmental emissions, and that's all okay, but it's there to really have an industrial policy. So that's maybe the reasons we didn't think that big. And now, on the contrary, we have a huge fight currently happening on the European level about climate. The Conservatives are basically saying we need a pause, that was all a little bit too much. If you see what the countries want to make of the net zero industry, they basically, the strategic industries that we have identified, solar, wind, heat pumps, electrolyzers, storage, grids, they are all deleted. So it's kind of, it becomes like and make it easy for the industry act altogether, which, maybe some people would like it, but it really takes away this strategic focus, and it in the competition with the US and China, that leaves us even further behind. So this is a problem, and I think that also is a problem. And then on the other hand, we have a lot of different kinds of policies. If you think about it, we have, for instance, stuff like the CHIPS Act, like the Batteries Act. On the European level, we have important projects of common European interest that should be kind of the tool of industrial policy to reshore industry. We have the ETS with the huge innovation fund, but actually even much bigger, all of the income to member state budgets. It's around 700 billion euros, all of this money. We have InvestEU, we have the Next Generation EU funding. So that's a whole lot of money, but there's just no streamlining, no idea behind what we actually want to do with it. And what I thought is really interesting, we do not have a clue where and how that money is actually spent. I mean, it would be great to understand in which, in which factory, in which site, in the end, all of this European money ends up, and that you can use it for mobilizing, for making campaigns around it. But we don't know, and that's a huge problem. Maybe that's something that we really need to take from, and that we could take from the US side, because unfortunately, all of these policies around tax breaks we cannot. So yeah, maybe stopping here. I believe we are really currently missing this window of opportunity. There's lots of interest, and kind of the next stage of industrial transformation is the climate transformation. But it seems that US and China have understood that, and EU is still quarreling around it, and by this lacking behind. And I believe that, I hope that learning from the US means that we do not speak about industrial production, but we actually do speak about jobs, do speak about secure jobs for the future. I mean, Europe, Germany's backbone is industry. And industry is changing. I come from Stuttgart, which is a manufacturing region. And I mean, lots of companies will not manufacture fossil engines or anything around it, but they still, I mean, I want them still to manufacture. They need to manufacture something else. And if we're missing this transformation, well, it will look different here in Stuttgart, and I don't want that. So we are lagging behind, and I hope, Sepp, you give us, with your report, some ideas of how to change that.
Thanks, Micha. Before I give it back to, I see, Daniela, you've really raised your hand. Maybe just to kind of guide the discussion, and also picking up from one of the questions from the audience, from Stephen. How do we design industrial policy to really be a systemic shift? What's kind of missing in the European approach so that is systemic? We've heard already some of the points. So more conditionality, more fiscal space to be able to spend, and more European fiscal space. But imagining a green big state, as Daniela has termed it. But what are the elements that we should be pushing for collectively as progressives? Daniela, maybe straight over to you if you want to start.
Thank you. I just wanted to take advantage of the fact that Michael is here and he's in the middle of things to ask, what is in your view, what are the obstacles that prevent us from knowing? You said we don't have enough, we don't have enough data to trace or to track carefully how this support that we are giving to private industries? Where is it going? How is it going? So what stops us from building state capacity to basically monitor and coordinate and to some extent ensure that there is some way in which we can discipline businesses into remaining on target and aligned with the priorities of our industrial strategy? I mean, I know the theoretical work and the scholarly work around how do you do this, but maybe maybe if you can speak something about the political obstacles to state capacity, which to me they have to do with the way in which we have designed this as a de-risking intervention, but maybe there is something else that we're missing.
Michele?
Well, I would love to hear more about what the academic insight is in this, but well, I firmly believe it's just the multi-level government that is well, blocking us from having this concrete responsibility lines. So, for instance, I mean, I'm asking my colleagues in the German parliament, so okay, what did you do with all of this recovery money? And you're like, yeah, true, let me check. But that it's, how do you say that? We give that money from the European level, but then it ends up with national parliaments, and they have their own rules, and some want to be transparent and some don't. I hope this will actually backfire, because until now the European level was not able to use debt, so we always spend what we got. But now with the recovery money, it's for the first time, it's the challenge that we actually need to raise money in order to pay the debt. So that puts us into the situation that we need to think, okay, where to take that money from? I mean, how to get it, what not to finance and what to finance. And that, I believe, I hope will create a little bit more accountability here. Then I think, well, it's just like that. I have been working in the local parliament before, and every time, you know, I don't know, they build some new road, high-speed internet connection. Maybe 75% is financed by the EU, but no one mentions the EU ever. So there is also this game of who can take the credit. And of course, those who spend the money, they want to take the credit, but they also don't want to be so transparent about that this is all coming from the EU. Maybe that's just two observations from my side.
Great, thanks. Does someone else want to come in on Judith?
Maybe to try and reflect a little bit on the question that you asked, Seb. So we're jumping backwards and forwards a little bit, but on how you would design an industrial policy to create a systemic change. And in our view, it's also about where you start from. Like, what's the goal of the industrial policy and the objectives? And I think that's where, from a union perspective, if one of the goals of the industrial policy is also to create a just transition for our society, then some of the policy framework would be differently placed. We would see a different mixture of policy instruments, and clearly social conditionalities would rise up the agenda very significantly. But one of the other areas that hasn't been mentioned in relation to the US model, but is really interesting from our perspective, is the way that the three piece of legislation, the kind of package, has also embedded questions around tax justice. And what we're seeing in Europe is you know, what we're hoping that MEPs might rectify is, but what we're seeing is this enormous transfer of wealth. And we've seen it over the last few years, where historic profits have been made. The real wages of workers are at the best stagnating, in most cases falling, in some cases falling very dramatically, with big rises in work poverty in industries which traditionally were industries that provided jobs that you could raise a family on and live comfortably on, a rise in precariousness. And I think that link with corporate governance and with taxation is really critical in terms of the design of kind of industrial policy measures. And so we were very interested, and I'd be interested in Todd's take on that, on the measures included, for example, in the IRA, that around bans on share buyback options, on extraordinary dividend payouts, because that's also a signal to the population that support for industry isn't just about continuing the kind of labor share, profit share divide, which we're seeing, but is actually about a wider systemic shift. And then the other thing which occurs to me is that, you know, in some parts of the European Commission, there are pounding red hearts of revolution. They hide themselves away very quietly and do some amazing thinking, but there's a lot of thinking in the Commission around concepts which are, it sounds very boring, but kind of labeled Industry 5.0, which would be building an industrial policy, an industrial framework where sustainability, human centricity are put on equal levels as kind of economic criteria and competitiveness. And sometimes this can feel a little bit kind of pie in the sky when you see the realities in some of the sectors that we represent. But there are some really interesting examples across Europe of companies who are revolutionizing the way that they operate and taking a radically different approach to their kind of triple bottom line, if you like. And I think those companies and that shift towards more human centricity, sustainability, and it in all of its forms, Europe's has been good at the green side of its sustainability, has been pretty poor on the social side of sustainability. So kind of this area of thinking around the future of industry, I think is quite exciting, actually, and looking at what that would mean in terms of corporate governance frameworks, but also industrial policy frameworks. And it links to a question that has come up in the Q&A, and then I'll be quiet, around different forms of ownership, and like also thinking about what other forms of ownership, what the role of those different models can be in a future more progressive, sustainable industrial policy for Europe. Some thoughts from our side.
Thank you. No, that's really good. I know, Michael, you have to leave us shortly, so I'll give you the word, and then very interested in Todd's view on the US after that.
Exactly. I just wanted to say I need to leave now soon. I think one of the huge issues is just that the EU was never built to do industrial policy. It was built as a common market. It was more like a deregulation project. And also the setup is difficult to really do industrial policy, because you have to please 27 member states, and doing that with basically a European level that is not very strong on fiscal policies, or it has no competence here, and also has not a lot of money. So I think it's really one of the central questions, because the world is changing. Big economic units, the US, China, India, they're doing industrial policy. And so we have to do it, but we don't know how. So I think it's really like also a question to you, like how can we do that? I mean, what are the best ways, front runner principle, whatever, how can we make it out of this institutional setup that's just there and not so easily changeable? And I think until now, I haven't really, I think this will be one of the big questions maybe for the next question, because honestly, like until the election next year, not a lot of things will happen, but that gives it a little bit of time to create some projects that hopefully then can be implemented. And I think just for Todd is the big question. I mean, how you told us a little bit about how you also created manufacturing possibilities in red states, and that's one of the recipe for success. Maybe you can tell us just a little bit more about what were the recipes for success that you could push through with the IRA.
Right. Yeah. I think that's one question that would be great, Todd. You could maybe expand on. And I think there's just a couple of questions in the chat about public ownership, about worker cooperatives and different business models. I wonder whether you can also expand a bit more whether equity stakes and public ownership are things that are being discussed in the US, which obviously would be quite systemic changes, considering how capitalist structures exist in the US.
Yeah, thanks for all the questions. And I actually was planning on responding to some of the ones from the chat as well. So that's great. And I'm flagging, I'll probably need to leave at like 5:40, 5:45, somewhere in there. So apologies in advance. But I mean, I think one of the interesting dynamics here is that there is a bit of a race to the top happening, where sort of, I don't know that the US would have done any of this legislation were it not for Made in China 2025, or for the various industrial policies that are happening in the EU that have been happening, or proposals even concretely like the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I mean, I think all of those things were hugely influential in encouraging us to sort of, to the extent that there were voices at the margin that were saying, we can't do industrial policy, that's too interventionist. It was easy to sort of point to all the things happening around the world as a reason to go ahead and do it. And so, I think that, despite some of the negative reaction in the EU initially to the IRA, I think we heard from Judith that it's actually leading to more of a productive conversation than we had before, and on the European side as well. So I think that, someone in the chat asked a question about how do you avoid sort of a subsidy race. I think for me, that's a little bit of the wrong framing in the sense that, the UN estimates that we need to be spending about $3.5 trillion a year in public investment to make the decarbonization transition happen. We're nowhere near that. And until we get to 4 trillion a year, I don't know that we need to be terribly worried about the amount of public investment, although I think, as Daniela rightly points out, thinking about the shape of how that investment works is really important. And that was actually sort of one point that I wanted to make about sort of the private versus public nature of the investment. I think that for me, the relative question is, are we getting private investment in the sectors that are important? Are we getting more private investment in the sectors that are important? Yes or no? Are we then getting more public and public-owned investment than we had previously? And I think that, I alluded to this in my comments about the announcements yesterday of the public institutions and nonprofit institutions qualifying for the money as well. And I think that's something that gets a little missed in international conversations around the United States, which is that, we have very strong state and local governments as well. And it just so happens that actually it's the state and local governments that are doing a lot of the sticks that are complementing the federal carrots. And that's one point to know, that is within 2 weeks of the IRA passing, you had California pass binding targets to phase out internal combustion vehicles by 2035. That was August 25th, 2022. It was about a week after the IRA passed, and that wasn't a coincidence at all. It was directly flowed from you were able to implement the stick because you had the carrot in place first. And so the sequencing is really important. It's not sort of all carrots or all sticks, but like making sure that the sequence works in a politically sustainable way. And the other thing that I would point out is that it's not all at the state and local level, although there's plenty of sticks happening there. It's also at the federal level. This year, the Environmental Protection Agency announced a rebooted set of regulatory standards to phase out fossil fuels in the power sector. And then that's going to be followed by similar standards for transportation and ultimately for heavy industry as well. And the thing is, none of that would have been possible were it not for getting the carrot in place first, so that you basically make it possible for the firms financially to install the new technology that would be necessary. So we're definitely, I think we're going to see a lot more public-owned investment than we would have seen in the absence of the IRA. Our energy infrastructure, someone made a point about FDR in the chat, that it was primarily, it went a lot through public investment. That's absolutely true in public production. The thing is, it's like right now, our energy grid is, I believe, about 70%, if not more, private owned. So what we're going to see is a move in the direction of more public ownership, but starting from a low base, basically. So it's going to be moving in the right direction. Tennessee Valley Authority, which is one of the FDR's big public energy production projects, was one of the entities specifically named in yesterday's announcement that they will be qualifying for all sorts of checks from the federal government. So it's just, it's important in the US to sort of pay attention to the levels at which the public power exists, and it's not always at the federal level. I think I wanted to also say, someone brought up a point about, where do less developed countries fit into all of this? And I think it's a fantastic question. It's the question I think we're going to be spending the next decade figuring out. I think that one of the upshots of having divided government in Washington right now is that we can't get anything further through Congress, or not very much. So that's a great opportunity to start thinking about the international dimension, because that is something where Biden still has control. And I think it's not a coincidence that you had in April of this year a major foreign policy speech by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor at the Brookings Institution. And if you haven't checked it out, I would recommend you checking it out. He spells out the end of the Washington Consensus and the end of neoliberalism. And I think that the reaction, some of the reaction among progressives to that was understandably that this is a little threadbare on specifics. But I think that how to think about that speech was that it was setting out the vision and the direction of travel. And it was basically an invitation to all of us on this call and all of us in our networks and to less developed countries to put the meat on the bones of what that vision looks like. And I think that we should spend the next 5 years making concrete proposals of how to integrate less developed countries in a proactive, moving up the ladder developmental strategy, and keep making those proposals until someone says no. Because I think that how to interpret that the Sullivan speech really is as an invitation to sort of begin developing that sort of international post-neoliberal project. And it would be inappropriate, and again against the very spirit of that speech, if Sullivan were just to declare, this is the game plan for developing countries, get on board. I think that it really is an invitation for developing countries to begin to make some of those proposals. And, I think he spelled out some interesting areas on a sectoral level where cooperation can be happening. I think the US and the EU are negotiating a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum. It's really important. It incorporates labor rights, it incorporates green production. There's a lot of nice things about it. And the good news is that if the US and EU come to some agreement on the basic terms of it by October, then after October, it's going to be open to the rest of the world as well. And so I think that it will be an important test of that to have a number of important developing countries, both steel producing and steel importing, into that mix so that their voices can be heard and they can continue to shape the trajectory of that policy.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, I think the global South and the external element of industrial policy is super interesting. And maybe Daniela, you can also come into in a second about what Europe should be doing internally to make its system change, but also externally to include global south and developing countries into a better framework. I was speaking to someone from representative of a global south country in Brussels recently, who was kind of making the argument that the comments about strategic autonomy were quite negative, and what actually should be the approach of Europe is strategic cooperation or strategic development, because autonomy kind of goes against the grain of all the opportunities that are present in the transition for countries that have lots of resources. And instead of trying to be autonomous from them, try to use this as an opportunity to help develop, and as Todd was kind of explaining, presenting it as an opportunity. But maybe Daniela, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to pick up a couple of things that Todd said, because in a sense, I suppose different polities and different local political economies generate different readings, and I can see that the sequencing matters, and that having lots of carrots makes some sticks easier. But the reality of the Europe, in contrast, in Europe, we started with a sticks and or carrots and sticks approach, and we are dropping the sticks as we go along. So I don't know that it's such a linear process in which everything kind of turns out nicely and moves towards the desired place. I think politics is much dirtier than that. And I am, in a sense, if you look at the experience of the European Central Bank, which doesn't just do decarbonization as a, on a general level, but it's coming up with methodologies for working out how do you penalize dirty sector, how do you shrink them through direct state intervention, not through market signals. And the way that I read your optimism, Todd, in particular, is to say that, with the right amount of subsidies and with the right amount of carrots and some sticks attached, we will get those dirty sectors shrinking. And I'm not so convinced that this is the case, or I'm not so convinced that it will be as it will unfold in an orderly way that is aligned with Paris targets and with the sense of urgency that I see in how the climate crisis is shaping up. So I would love to be proven wrong, of course, but I don't share your optimism. And I also think that possibly in 6 months' time, we will have maybe a less optimistic assessment of what the IRA in particular has achieved. On electric vehicles, for example, I'm not sure that building big tanks that you can plug into in a socket is really the kind of outcome that should be celebrated. Sorry, and also I meant to say for the Global South, there is, from Europe, again, if you look at the Global Gateway or if you look at the German driven initiatives for green hydrogen, there is the possibility that the green industrial policy and in general, the way in which you have chosen to organize decarbonization increases rather than reduces the unequal ecological exchange that we have seen over the past decades, if not more. And I don't see, I can see, we can all read the optimistic invitations to change the hard geopolitical realities, but I don't see from Europe some very specific material willingness translated in institutions building or translated in cross-border cooperation that would ensure increased green industrial capacity in the Global South. I look at Namibia's cooperation with German companies on green hydrogen, and it doesn't spell to me a lot of ambitious or a lot of space for thinking creatively how countries will kick away the dirty ladder. But yeah, it is in a sense maybe coming from a glass more than half full in Europe that is emptying, and you coming from an empty glass and seeing things accumulating. Maybe we have different readings.
Could I just say maybe one thing, and then I'm going to need to leave, unfortunately. Yeah, I think that's right. Like there are some hypotheses that have been advanced in terms of the political economy of how this is going to unfold, that we will have evidence for, in the years to come. And I think that from a, kind of geeky research perspective, I'll just also say that the fact that there's going to be so much variability in the kinds of projects that we're going to see, we're going to see some that want to, import everything from China just so that they can do solar deployment. And we're going to see others that are going to have strong domestic content and labor content requirements. We're going to be able to test in real time which projects work, which projects don't work, and sort of what are some of the explanations for that. So I think that there's going to be, a million different dissertation opportunities for the researchers in your network to be examining some of it. I mean, I think that, there are, I think that for me, the question is, how credible would a US commitment to decarbonization be if it meant further deindustrialization of the auto sector? I think for the US, if Detroit were to disappear as a result of the decarbonization, we would reverse that decarbonization effort really quickly in order to keep internal combustion engine vehicles on the road. So I think that, it has to be sort of credible as a matter of the political economy and industrial economy of the country. We're also, we're not quite a petro state, but we're more of a petro state than the Europeans are, and that we have a lot of our workers that rely directly and indirectly on fossil fuel industry and production. So I think that, the approach that the US is taking is essentially going sector by sector in a more sort of, measured way to try to reduce demand for fossil fuel products from the other industries that consume them. So if we sort of wean the vehicle industry off of fossil fuels, then we wean the steel industry off of fossil fuels, then we, kind of go down the line that way in a more sectorally oriented approach, then that's going to be more of a managed transition that I think will balance the need to sort of keep sort of a status quo in terms of level of jobs while also decarbonizing. But I fully accept that this could well not work. And we're going to know that in the years to come. And Sebastian, thank you so much. And Judith and Daniela, so nice to spend time with you, and best of luck.
Thank you, Todd, for joining the webinar. Judith, Judith, please.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to jump in. I mean, it's the survival of the fittest for who's still online, I guess. So we're probably going to wrap up quickly, but I think on this question of the global south, I think this is also another example of how Europe is missing an opportunity to do things a bit differently. I mean, the danger is that what we're embarked on is really a kind of neo-colonial project in terms of raw materials, in terms of hydrogen, and there are other ways of doing it, which I actually really like that shift of strategic autonomy to strategic cooperation. But we have to recognize that the global economy is also regionalizing, and that has implications for our strategy in Europe as well. I was just to give an anecdote for those who hung on to the end to show how shallow in some ways some of this is in the rhetoric, in the behind the scenes speak of the European Commission. I was in a very high level meeting on the automotive sector a few weeks ago, in which a very high profile French politician who's very important in industrial policy circles and has a European hat, and you can decide who that could be, was speaking to the automotive industry, and the first thing that was said was, in 2050, 70% of cars in the world will be internal combustion engines, so we can still produce to export. Now, if that is the logic behind an industrial policy strategy, then for us, we're completely missing a lot of the geopolitical dynamics going on, a lot of the fact that markets are regionalizing, the fact that industrial policy isn't about our classic economic model with a green veneer, that actually, if you're thinking about what net zero looks like in practice, then we have to have conversations about not just resource efficiency, but also concepts of sufficiency, concepts of, which are in the whole beyond growth paradigm. Very complicated debates. These are debates that we're having and trying to nurture inside the trade union movement. But it's very, very complicated when the economic paradigm that workers find themselves in Europe today is still a brutal race, in many cases, race on price and cost cutting and skimming the margins whilst ensuring big profit gains for those at the top. So that's why it's great that industrial policy is on the agenda. But if we're really serious about an industrial policy which is linked to net zero and a paradigm shift, then we just have to be far, far more ambitious. And definitely the US haven't got everything right. I mean, like that's clear, and there will be lots of mistakes made, but the way that they have created their policy from the outset sets them off in a better direction than we're setting off in Europe, in our view, in the trade union. The thing is, it's not too late. This is legislation which is on the table. It's legislation which can be amended, and so we really hope that the first report of the European Parliament won't look like the final outcome of negotiations, and that member states will also be brave enough to think about what we actually need in terms of an industrial policy framework for Europe to fit with our climate objectives. And
thank you, Judith. Yes, indeed. I mean, there's also the European elections coming up, and industrial policy is not going to go away. And I think we need to make a progressive case for progressive industrial policy. And I think lots of the themes that were discussed today are also proposals that the New Economics Foundation and our report Beyond the Bottom Line have put forward. So maybe just to wrap up with kind of very quick run through of what we were recommending in terms of industrial policy. The first thing was, and this is built on many academics, including Mazzucato and others. The first thing is directionality and having clarity about what we want to achieve. Right now, the Commission's thinking about industrial policy to improve competitiveness, but it should be about a workers' rights agenda. It should be about improving climate action, and that's missing in the proposals so far. The second thing is having more state capacity. And if you look at the absorption rate of investments, lots of countries such as Italy and others have, because of austerity over the last decade, just been hollowed out, and they need to have more money spent on state capacity, more expertise, more skilled labor in authorities to be able to do industrial policy, and then that link to proper industrial planning, because industrial planning means that you recognize where you are and think about where you want to be and what steps you need to take to get there. I mean, I'm guessing that some countries in Europe are not going to be the most high-tech industrial locations. Romania or other countries in Eastern Europe might not be the first to be producing the most high-tech solar panels, but they might be producing elements that go into that production. So we need industrial planning that really recognizes where we are and where we want to be. Thirdly, we need to have conditionality, as many speakers today have been talking about, and what the US is doing has elements of that. But as Daniela said, and also Judith, it needs to be about conditionality that's also linked to producing the right kind of products. Building big SUVs with big batteries is not the most efficient use of limited, scarce energy and material throughput, and we should be reducing that. So having conditions that require companies in Europe producing cars to produce lighter vehicles would be a big step in the right direction. And finally, equity stakes and having more public ownership or equity stakes in companies is the other element that we've proposed in our industrial policy kind of pitch. So this kind of I hope wraps up from some of the elements, not everything that was discussed. And I'd like to thank Judith Daniela, Todd, and Michael, who've unfortunately had to leave for this interesting discussion. You'll be able to watch this on YouTube and do share. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.